I bought an old house at a tax auction for $230. My family laughed at what they called my latest pathetic failure. They had no idea that when I took a sledgehammer to a rotting wall in that very house, I would discover a hidden compartment holding $2 million in cash and a sealed envelope. Opening that envelope did not just change my financial status. It gave me the exact weapon I needed to destroy the fake pedestal my toxic family stood on. They were not just cruel people. They were white-collar criminals. And I, the daughter they treated like garbage, was holding the match to burn their empire to the ground. Before I tell you how I brought them all down, let me know where you are watching from in the comments and hit subscribe if you love seeing arrogant people get exactly what they deserve. The nightmare started at my sister Serena and her wealthy husband Bradley throwing a lavish housewarming party at their new mansion. I was not officially invited to mingle with their rich guests in the main dining room. Instead, I was summoned to the kitchen like a hired servant. The catering staff bustled around me while I stood near the massive stainless steel island. Bradley, wearing a custom-tailored suit that cost more than my entire annual salary, walked in with Serena trailing closely behind him. He did not even bother to say hello to me. Instead, he tossed a crisp check for $5,000 onto the marble counter right in front of my face. "Take the money and sign over the deed right now, Chloe," he demanded, his tone dripping with the kind of condescension only a rich developer could muster. "That dilapidated shack you bought at the tax auction sits squarely in the middle of my new luxury gentrification project. You are going to ruin the aesthetic of the entire block with that garbage property." Serena adjusted her diamond necklace and scoffed loudly. "You really thought you did something smart buying a condemned property for $230. You are embarrassing us, Chloe. Take his generous offer before he changes his mind completely. You know you desperately need the cash right now." I stared at the check, feeling my blood boil. I was a professional heritage preservationist. My ultimate goal was to protect historical neighborhoods from being bulldozed by greedy developers exactly like him. The house I bought had deep historical significance to our local community. "I am not selling," I said calmly, keeping my voice steady. "That house is staying exactly where it is." Before Bradley could respond, the kitchen doors swung open and my parents walked in. My father, Marcus, a highly respected deacon at our church, looked at me with the familiar disappointment I had endured my entire life. My mother, Vivian, stood silently beside him, her face pulled into a permanent grimace of disapproval. "Stop causing trouble for your sister and her husband," my father scolded, pointing a finger directly at me. "Why do you always have to be so difficult? Bradley just donated $100,000 to the church building fund this morning. He is actively uplifting this community while you play in the dirt." I looked at my father, the man who was supposed to protect me unconditionally. "Uplifting the community by forcing local families out of their homes so he can build luxury condos no one here can afford," I countered. My father slammed his heavy hand onto the counter. "You have absolutely no right to lecture anyone about success in this house. You dropped out of Howard Law School, threw away a brilliant legal career, and for what, exactly? To become an independent heritage preservationist scraping by on pity grant money. Look at your sister Serena. She married well, maintains a beautiful home, and elevates our family name. You are a constant stain on our public reputation." The sheer toxicity of his cruel words hung heavily in the tense air. For 33 years I had swallowed their insults without fighting back. I had let them treat me as the family's scapegoat while elevating Serena to a golden pedestal she did not earn. I looked down at the $5,000 check resting on the cold marble counter. Bradley was smirking widely, clearly expecting me to fold under my father and his intense pressure, just as I had done so many times when I was younger. But I was not that scared little girl anymore. I picked up the check. For a second, Bradley looked triumphant. Then deliberately, and maintaining strict eye contact with my arrogant brother-in-law, I tore the check straight down the middle. I stacked the two ripped pieces together and tore them again, letting the shredded paper flutter onto the pristine kitchen floor. "My house, my rules," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying absolute authority. You might be able to buy the city council with church funds, Bradley, but you cannot buy me. That historic house will stand as a monument long after your cheap condos crumble into dust. I turned my back on their shocked gasps and walked out the door, ignoring Serena yelling that I was a jealous failure. I grabbed a sledgehammer and walked into the basement of my new property. I swung at a patched wall with everything I had. The drywall gave way, revealing a dark cavity. I shined my flashlight into the gap and my breath caught. Stacked inside the hidden compartment were rows of tightly bound cash, $2 million wrapped in plastic. Resting on the money was a sealed envelope and a flash drive. My hands trembled as I tore open the envelope. Inside was a paper bearing one word: Vanguard. I plugged the drive into my laptop. The audio file revealed my father discussing a money laundering scheme with Bradley. I finally had the power to destroy them. I sat on the dusty concrete floor of the basement, staring at the glowing screen of my laptop. The audio file I just played was only the beginning. My heart pounded against my ribs like a trapped bird. I clicked on the main directory of the flash drive. A password prompt popped up instantly, blocking my access to the rest of the folders. I grabbed the single piece of paper I had pulled from the sealed envelope resting on top of the cash. The word Vanguard was typed in bold black letters. I typed the letters into the password field and hit enter. The screen flashed green and dozens of hidden folders suddenly populated my desktop. I opened the first file labeled Property Acquisitions and a massive spreadsheet loaded. My eyes scanned the rows of addresses, dates, and transaction amounts. These were not legitimate real estate deals. They were a systematic map of financial slaughter. Bradley had been targeting vulnerable Black families in our historical district for the past 5 years. I recognized the names of the homeowners. These were people I grew up seeing at Sunday service. People my father supposedly guided as a deacon of the church. I clicked on another folder titled Thompson Estate. Elias Thompson was the previous owner of this very house. He was an elderly, retired postal worker who had lived in this community for 4 decades. He passed away suddenly last year from a massive heart attack right before the bank finalized his foreclosure. Everyone in the neighborhood thought it was just a tragedy of old age and bad debt. But the documents on the flash drive painted a much darker picture. Elias had not just fallen behind on his mortgage. He had been targeted by a predatory lending scheme orchestrated by Bradley. Bradley used shell companies to buy up the debt of elderly residents, then aggressively hiked the interest rates until they defaulted. I opened a scanned, handwritten letter saved in the folder. It was a digital copy of a note Elias had written before he died. The handwriting was shaky, but the message was clear. I read the words aloud in the empty basement. "They think I am just a foolish old man, but I know what Bradley is doing. I was doing repair work at his downtown office building when I saw the courier drop off the duffel bag. I heard them talking about the payoffs for the city zoning board. They are buying the city council to force us out of our homes. When Bradley left the room, I took the bag. I hid the $2 million in the walls of my basement. If they want my home, they will have to tear it down with me inside it. But I leave this evidence behind for whoever finds it. Do not let them pave over our history." Elias had intercepted Bradley and his massive cash bribe meant for the city officials. He hid the money and the digital records he managed to swipe right here in this basement. The stress of the ensuing harassment and the aggressive foreclosure tactics Bradley deployed to get the house back had literally killed Elias. Bradley did not just want this property for his luxury gentrification project. He wanted it because he knew his missing bribe money and the incriminating evidence were somewhere inside these walls. That was why Bradley was so desperate to force me to sign over the deed at the housewarming party. He needed to demolish the house and recover his illicit cash before anyone else discovered his dirty secrets. I closed the letter feeling a physical wave of nausea. My brother-in-law was a monster who preyed on the most vulnerable members of our community. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. I noticed a subfolder named Church Vanguard Trust. My stomach churned as I double-clicked the icon. The folder contained bank transfer receipts connecting Bradley and his offshore development accounts directly to the main charity fund of our church, the exact same fund my father managed as the head deacon. I opened the final audio file in the directory. The recording was crystal clear. It was a recent phone call between Bradley and my father, Marcus. I pressed play and leaned closer to the speakers. The sheer casualness in their voices made my skin crawl. "We need to accelerate the foreclosures on the east side, Marcus," Bradley said, his voice carrying that familiar, arrogant drawl. "The city council is getting impatient and the zoning permits expire in 6 months. I cannot start pouring concrete for the luxury condos until those residents are gone." "I am handling it, Bradley," my father replied, his tone smooth and authoritative. The exact same voice he used to preach about moral integrity every Sunday morning. "I have already approved the transfers from the church charity account. We are using the congregation donations to buy up the remaining debt portfolios of those holdouts. Once the church officially holds their loans, I will personally visit them and explain that the church simply cannot afford to extend their grace period. They will sign over their deeds voluntarily out of shame." "You are a genius, Marcus." Bradley laughed loudly. "Using the church funds to finance my condo project while making the congregation think you are trying to help them is brilliant work. The new transfer should cover the rest of the council bribes since that old fool Elias stole the last drop. Just make sure your daughter Chloe does not poke her nose into this. She has been sniffing around the historical registry trying to get that neighborhood protected status." "Do not worry about Chloe," my father sneered through the speakers. "She is a stubborn failure who thinks she can save the world with a useless preservation degree. She has no power, no money, and no influence. I will make sure she is entirely discredited before she strikes. Send the remaining cash today." The recording clicked off, leaving a deafening silence in the basement. My own father was leveraging the faith and finances of our entire community to help a predatory developer steal their homes. The $2 million sitting next to me was blood money ripped from the hands of hardworking people like Elias. I quickly transferred the files to a secure cloud server and packed the cash into heavy-duty duffel bags, hiding them in a crawl space beneath the floorboards. I barely slept that night. The betrayal burned hot in my chest, but I knew I had to stay sharp. The next morning, a loud pounding on my front door jolted me awake. I threw on a jacket and opened the door to find a city inspector flanked by 2 private security contractors wearing Bradley's company logos on their vests. The inspector did not even look me in the eye as he slapped a bright orange sticker directly onto my front window. I demanded to know what he was doing. He handed me a clipboard with a stack of legal documents. "Emergency demolition notice," he stated mechanically. "The city zoning board has deemed this structure a critical hazard to public safety. The foundation is compromised, and the roof is at risk of imminent collapse. You have exactly 7 days to vacate the premises and execute a full demolition at your own expense. If you fail to comply, the city will bulldoze it and bill you." I stared at the bright orange sticker. The paint on the house was peeling and the porch was sagging, but the foundation was solid stone. This was not a safety inspection. This was Bradley pulling his corrupt strings with the city council to force me out and tear the house down to get his hidden cash. Before the inspector even drove away, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I answered it and heard the unmistakable sound of clinking champagne glasses in the background. My sister Serena was calling to gloat. "Good morning, Chloe," she chirped, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Bradley just told me the unfortunate news about your little real estate venture. It is such a shame the city is forcing you to tear down that miserable eyesore. I told you buying that dump was a pathetic mistake. You should have taken his $5,000 check when you had the chance. Now you are going to be bankrupted by demolition fees." I stood on my porch looking at the orange sticker. "You and Bradley orchestrated this," I said flatly. Serena laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "We are just accelerating the inevitable, Chloe. Bradley is transforming this neighborhood into something valuable. Black excellence means elevating the family and building an empire. It does not mean clinging to the slums and pretending you are some kind of neighborhood savior. Stop embarrassing us and let the bulldozers do their job." She hung up before I could reply. Her words echoed in my mind. Elevating the family. They were not elevating anyone. They were standing on the necks of the vulnerable to reach the top. But Serena and Bradley had made a massive miscalculation. They saw a desperate woman holding a useless degree. They forgot that my preservation credentials gave me access to federal jurisdictions that bypass their corrupt local politicians completely. I did not panic. I did not call my father to beg for mercy. I went straight to my laptop. The house was not just old, it was historically significant. Elias Thompson was not the first notable resident. Through my previous research, I knew this house was built by one of the original founders of the local civil rights movement in the 1920s. I had the original blueprints, the historical deeds, and the architectural surveys, proving its cultural value to the African American community. I compiled the documents and drafted an emergency federal injunction. Local zoning boards are incredibly powerful, but they are completely powerless when a property is nominated for the National Register of Historic Places. Federal law prohibits the demolition of any structure pending a federal historical review. I submitted the paperwork directly to the Federal Preservation Office, flagging it for immediate judicial review based on the predatory actions of the local municipality. I spent the next 48 hours aggressively calling every contact I had in the National Heritage Network. I leveraged my entire professional reputation to get a federal judge to look at the injunction before Bradley could send his crews. On the morning of the 5th day, I sat on my front porch drinking coffee. The sound of heavy diesel engines rumbled down the street. Bradley was not even waiting for the 7-day deadline to expire. A massive yellow bulldozer turned the corner, followed by a black luxury SUV. Bradley stepped out of the vehicle wearing a tailored suit and a smug grin. He walked up to my gate, flanked by his demolition crew. "Time is up, Chloe," he announced, pulling off his sunglasses. "You refused my money, so now you get nothing. Clear out. The crew is knocking this down today." I took a very slow sip of my coffee. I did not move. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a thick envelope stamped with the seal of a federal judge. I walked down the porch steps and shoved the envelope directly into his chest. "You might own the city council, Bradley," I said, my voice carrying across the quiet street. "But you do not own the federal government. That is an emergency federal injunction freezing all demolition orders on this property indefinitely. The house is now under federal protection as a pending historical landmark. If your bulldozer touches a single piece of wood on this property, you will be arrested for a federal crime." Bradley tore open the envelope. His face drained of color as he read the judge's signature. The smug grin vanished entirely, replaced by a look of absolute fury. He crumpled the envelope in his fist, his knuckles turning white, but he knew he was beaten for now. He gestured sharply to his demolition crew. "Shut it down and pack it up," he barked before storming back to his luxury vehicle. The bulldozer retreated down the street, its heavy treads grinding against the pavement. I watched them leave, knowing this was only a minor delay. Sunday arrived, and with it the ultimate theater of hypocrisy. I walked into the grand sanctuary of our community church, a building my ancestors had helped fund brick by brick. The pews were packed with the local elite. Up on the raised altar, my father Marcus stood bathed in the soft light of the stained glass windows. He wore a flawless suit, his voice booming through the sound system, delivering a passionate sermon about community upliftment and righteous prosperity. Sitting directly in the front row in the designated VIP seating was Bradley, nodding solemnly along with every word. The sheer audacity of the display made my stomach churn. My father preached about protecting the flock while actively facilitating their financial ruin. He looked down at the congregation with a benevolent smile while holding a knife behind his back. When the service concluded, the sanctuary transformed into a high society networking event. The aisles filled with local politicians and wealthy business owners shaking hands. I spotted the city mayor standing near the main doors, laughing at a joke my father had just made. This was my chance. If I got the mayor on the record, I could build a public wall around my property. I stepped into the main aisle and headed straight for them. I did not make it 3 steps before a manicured hand clamped down hard on my forearm. My mother Vivian stepped directly into my path, her expensive perfume suffocating the air between us. Her perfectly painted nails dug sharply into my skin through my jacket sleeve. "Where exactly do you think you are going?" she hissed, keeping her voice low so the surrounding parishioners would not hear. "I am going to speak with the mayor," I replied, trying to pull my arm free. "About the sudden historical significance of my new property." Vivian tightened her grip and shoved me backward toward a secluded alcove. "You will do no such thing," she spat, her eyes flashing with venom. "Look at you, Chloe. You show up to Sunday service wearing a cheap off-the-rack blazer. You are a complete embarrassment. The mayor is currently discussing a major city contract with your brother-in-law. I will not let you ruin our social standing with your pathetic crusade for a condemned shack." I looked at the woman who birthed me. Her entire identity was wrapped up in the illusion of elite status. "You care more about looking rich than your own husband stealing from this congregation," I said, keeping my voice calm. She did not even flinch. "Black excellence is about power and access, Chloe. It is about sitting at the table where the decisions are made. Your sister understood that, and married a man who provides it. You chose to roll in the mud. Now stay in your corner and keep your mouth shut before I have the ushers escort you off the premises." She released my arm and walked back toward the mayor, pasting a brilliant fake smile onto her face. I did not follow her. I had a different target in mind. I slipped down the narrow side corridor leading to the private vestry. This was the secure room where deacons held private meetings. I pushed the heavy oak door open without knocking. My father and Bradley were standing by a mahogany table, poring over a stack of architectural blueprints. They both snapped their heads up as I entered. "I told you to keep her under control," Marcus Bradley snapped, rolling up the blueprints. My father straightened his tie, looking at me with pure disgust. "You have no business being back here, Chloe. Get out before I call security." I stepped further into the room, letting the heavy door click shut behind me. "You two put on a great show out there," I said, crossing my arms. "Uplifting the community while actively plotting to bulldoze it. How much of today's collection plate is going straight into the Vanguard Trust Fund?" My father stepped forward, his face darkening with rage. "You have zero proof of anything, you arrogant little failure. That federal injunction is a minor roadblock. I have friends in Washington. I will have your historical claim thrown out by the end of the month. You are out of your league." Bradley stepped in front of my father, closing the distance between us until he was towering over me. His expensive cologne masked the scent of old paper in the room. He leaned down, his face inches from mine. The mask of the generous benefactor melted away, revealing the ugly truth. "You really think you can win this?" he whispered, his voice dripping with condescension. "You people always do this. You get a little piece of garbage property, and suddenly you think you are sitting on a gold mine. You cling to this heritage nonsense because you have nothing of actual value to offer. You are just a loud, angry woman standing in the way of real progress. People like you do not make history, Chloe. You just get paved over by men like me. Take whatever pennies I throw at you and walk away." I stared into his eyes, refusing to back down. "You are confident for a man standing inside a church," I said. Bradley let out a short laugh. "God favors the wealthy." He turned to my father. "Deal with her, Marcus." I walked out into the sunlight, reaching into my cheap blazer. I pulled out my phone and pressed stop on the audio recording app. Bradley just handed me the rope to hang them both. The following Tuesday, I sent a single text message to my mother. It was brief and deliberately desperate. I told her I was out of money and could not fight Bradley and his high-powered lawyers anymore. I asked for a meeting to discuss surrendering the property. Within 10 minutes, my mother replied with a calendar invite to an upscale artisanal coffee shop in the wealthiest district of the city. It was exactly the kind of pretentious establishment where a cup of espresso cost $12 and the patrons wore designer athleisure to sip matcha lattes. I arrived early and found a booth in the back corner. I wore an oversized gray sweater and kept my shoulders slumped, playing the part of the broken, defeated woman they all expected me to be. They walked in 15 minutes late. My mother Vivian led the way holding a designer handbag that cost more than my first car. My sister Serena followed close behind, scrolling on her phone with a bored expression. My father Marcus brought up the rear wearing a sharp navy suit, looking incredibly pleased with himself. Bradley was notably absent, which was perfect. I only needed my immediate blood relatives for this specific phase of my plan. They slid into the leather booth across from me, their faces a portrait of collective triumph. Well, Chloe, my mother started setting her expensive bag on the pristine table. I am glad you finally came to your senses. Your father told me about the little tantrum you threw at the church. It is exhausting dealing with your constant drama. We are here to put an end to it today, once and for all. I stared at my hands resting on the table, keeping my voice low and shaking slightly. You win, I said, looking up at my father. I cannot afford the federal legal fees to fight Bradley's connections in Washington. The Preservation Board told me the process could take years and I am completely broke. If I keep pushing this, I will end up bankrupt. I brought the papers to discuss signing over the deed to the property. Serena let out a loud, mocking laugh that drew stares from the neighboring tables. I told you this would happen, she gloated, leaning across the table. You tried to play the hero and ended up exactly where you belong. Nowhere. Next time, leave the real estate business to the adults who actually know how to build an empire. You should have taken the $5,000 when you had the chance. Now you are just begging for mercy. I slid a thick manila folder across the table. Before I give you the deed to the house, there is one condition, I said softly. My father narrowed his eyes, his jaw tightening. You are in no position to make demands, Chloe. Hand over the property, and Bradley might generously cover your demolition fines. You should be thanking us for bailing you out of this mess. It is not a demand for money, I replied, opening the folder and extracting a stack of legal documents printed on heavy cardstock. It is a severance agreement. If I hand over this multi-million-dollar location to Bradley, I know my reputation in the historical preservation community will be completely destroyed. I will be bankrupt and unemployable. So before I sign away the deed, I need you all to sign this severance of familial and financial ties. My mother frowned, examining the top page with disdain. What exactly does this mean? It means we are legally severing all ties, I explained, keeping my eyes fixed on the table to hide the intensity of my gaze. It legally detaches me from your estates, your trusts, and your financial liabilities. You will not owe me a single dime of support when I go bankrupt, and I cannot ever claim a cent of your wealth. We become legally recognized strangers in the eyes of the law and the government. If you sign this, I will sign the deed over to Bradley tomorrow morning. A slow, cruel smile spread across my mother's face. She reached into her purse and pulled out a gold-plated pen. She did not even bother to read the fine print. Oh, I am signing this immediately, Vivian declared, her voice dripping with venom. The last thing I need is your inevitable bankruptcy destroying my credit score. I am currently applying for the presidency of the Elite Heritage Society, and if they find out my daughter filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, it would completely ruin my social standing. You have been a financial and social liability to this family since you dropped out of law school. This document is an absolute blessing. She signed her name with an elegant flourish and shoved the paper toward Marcus. My father barely glanced at the pages. He saw only the ultimate victory, the submission of his rebellious daughter and the acquisition of the final puzzle piece for Bradley's fraudulent empire. A clean break is best for everyone, Marcus agreed, scribbling his signature next to my mother's. You chose your path of failure, Chloe. Do not come crying to us when you are sleeping in a shelter. Serena snatched the pen from him. I am signing too, she sneered. Black excellence means elevating the family, not dragging it down into the slums. I refuse to let your pathetic life choices drag down my brand. My husband is building the future, and you are just a stepping stone we finally crushed. Good riddance. Serena slashed her signature across the bottom line with absolute satisfaction. They shoved the signed documents back across the table. My mother stood up, smoothing her designer coat and looking down her nose at me. Bring the deed to Bradley's office by 9 tomorrow morning, she ordered, And Chloe, do not bother calling us for Thanksgiving. We are officially done here. I watched them walk out of the coffee shop. They were laughing together, completely oblivious to the reality of what had just occurred. They thought they had just protected their precious wealth from a destitute family member. I waited until their luxury SUV pulled out of the parking lot before I picked up the documents. My hands were no longer shaking. My posture straightened. I slid the legally binding severance of familial and financial ties carefully back into the manila folder. I did not care about their insults or their cruel laughter. The pain of their rejection had died a long time ago. What they did not know was that this document had absolutely nothing to do with my financial ruin. It had everything to do with theirs. By signing those papers, my parents and sister had legally and permanently severed me from their assets, their trusts, and their liabilities. When the federal agents froze their bank accounts and seized their properties, my name would be entirely legally protected. I had just secured my absolute legal shield against the impending FBI asset freeze that would soon hit my entire family. They had gleefully signed their own isolation warrants. I finished my coffee, stood up, and walked out into the afternoon sun. I had an appointment with a former federal prosecutor, and it was time to prepare the guillotine. Thanksgiving arrived, wrapped in the bitter chill of late November. I pulled my 10-year-old sedan into the sweeping, circular driveway of my parents' sprawling estate. The severance documents were safely locked in a safety deposit box, but I still needed one final piece of evidence to ensure the FBI had an airtight case against Bradley and my father. The Vanguard audio files were damning, but I needed the master ledger, and I knew exactly where Bradley kept it. I walked through the massive mahogany front doors, wearing a faded beige sweater and scuffed boots, playing my assigned role of the defeated failure to perfection. The grand dining room was a spectacle of excessive wealth. Crystal glasses sparkled under the massive chandelier, and the air was thick with the scent of roasted turkey and expensive perfume. My mother, Vivian, was holding court by the fireplace, boasting about her upcoming society events. Serena intercepted me in the hallway before I could even take off my coat. She looked me up and down, her lips curling into a sneer of absolute disgust. She was wearing a custom silk dress that easily cost more than my entire car. "You actually wore that to a holiday dinner," she scoffed, flicking her wrist dismissively. "You look like a homeless person who wandered in off the street. Do not even think about sitting at the main table, Chloe. I have seated you at the overflow table in the sunroom with the younger cousins. I will not have your poverty aesthetic ruining my holiday photos on social media." I lowered my head, forcing my voice to sound meek and broken. "I understand, Serena. I will stay out of the way. I brought the property transfer intent forms just like I promised." She snatched the fake folder from my hands and smirked triumphantly. She sashayed back into the dining room, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She thought she was putting me in my place. She had no idea she was giving me exactly the tactical advantage I desperately needed. The sunroom was completely isolated from the main dining area and offered a direct line of sight to the hallway leading to Bradley's private guest study. Dinner commenced with the usual sickening display of arrogance. I sat quietly at the small folding table, picking at my dry food, while the booming voice of my brother-in-law echoed from the main room. Bradley was holding court, his wine glass raised high. He was practically vibrating with unhinged greed. "Next week is the official groundbreaking ceremony," he declared to the table of adoring relatives and corrupt business partners. The city council finally approved the expedited demolition permits for that pathetic little historic block. "We are bringing true luxury to this city and clearing out the dead weight once and for all." My father chimed in, his voice dripping with religious hypocrisy. "The Lord rewards those who take bold action to elevate the community. We are building an empire, Bradley, to progress and absolute prosperity." The table erupted in cheers and the loud clinking of expensive crystal. My mother chimed in, agreeing that removing the neighborhood blight was a noble cause. I gripped my fork tightly. They were toasting to the destruction of vulnerable families. They were celebrating their own corruption. Then my father tapped his knife against his glass, demanding absolute silence for his traditional Thanksgiving sermon. I checked my watch. I knew this toast would take exactly 12 minutes. My father loved hearing himself speak more than anything else in the world, and he always used this moment to perform his role as the righteous patriarch. I slipped out of my chair, moving silently across the carpeted floor of the sunroom. The hallway was completely deserted. The catering staff was busy in the kitchen, and every single guest was held captive in the dining room by my father's booming voice. I glided down the corridor and pressed my hand against the heavy oak door of the guest study. Bradley was incredibly arrogant. He believed this mansion was an impenetrable fortress of elite privilege. He never bothered to lock doors. The handle turned easily, and I slipped inside, closing the door behind me. The room was dark except for the glowing screen of Bradley's laptop resting open on the massive mahogany desk. He had been reviewing architectural renderings before dinner and left the machine completely unlocked. I pulled a specialized black USB drive from my pocket. My contact, the former federal prosecutor, had provided it. It was military-grade software designed to mirror a hard drive and bypass basic encryption in less than 3 minutes. I jammed the drive into the USB port and executed the program. A progress bar appeared on the screen calculating the data transfer. I watched as the file names flashed across the display. Vanguard Offshore Trust, church charity transfers, city council payouts. The master ledger of their entire criminal enterprise was pouring into my hands. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. In the distance, I could hear my father droning on about divine blessings and financial stewardship. The progress bar crawled past 50%. I kept my eyes darting between the laptop screen and the sliver of light beneath the study door. If Bradley walked in now, the entire operation would be destroyed, and I would be facing a team of ruthless corporate lawyers. 75%. My father's voice grew louder, reaching the crescendo of his speech. 90%. Sweat beaded on the back of my neck. "Come on," I whispered, urging the machine faster. A soft chime sounded. "Transfer complete." I yanked the USB drive out and shoved it deep into my pocket. I closed the architectural rendering software, leaving the screen exactly as I found it. I slipped out of the study and glided back down the hallway, sliding into my folding chair in the sunroom, just as the dining room erupted in a loud chorus of amens. Bradley thought he had conquered the neighborhood. He thought I was just a defeated failure eating scraps in the other room. He had no idea I had just stolen the digital keys to his entire criminal kingdom. I left the Thanksgiving dinner extremely early, claiming a sudden debilitating migraine. My mother did not even bother to look up from her second glass of red wine. She simply waved me away with a dismissive flick of her wrist, irritated that my illness was distracting from her holiday aesthetic. Serena rolled her eyes and muttered something about my inability to handle social situations. I ignored their cruel remarks. I walked out the front doors and drove straight through the freezing autumn rain, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned completely white. My destination was a nondescript, brutalist apartment building on the industrial edge of the city. I bypassed the lobby and took the rattling freight elevator directly to the 4th floor. A heavy steel door swung open before my knuckles even struck the metal frame. Standing in the threshold was Valerie Hayes. She was a brilliant former federal prosecutor who had lost her badge 3 years ago. Bradley and his political cronies had orchestrated a vicious smear campaign against her the moment she started asking too many questions about his municipal zoning contracts. She lost her career, her reputation, and her pension. Now she operated strictly in the shadows, consulting for corporate whistleblowers and gathering ammunition to take down the untouchable elites who had ruined her life. We walked into her office. Large computer servers hummed against the exposed brick walls, and the air smelled of stale coffee and relentless determination. I pulled the black USB drive from my pocket and placed it on her desk. "I got it," I said, my voice trembling slightly from the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. The entire master ledger. Valerie picked up the device, her eyes gleaming with a dangerous kind of satisfaction. She plugged it into a modified laptop that remained permanently disconnected from any external network. "You pulled it off," she muttered, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "I told you I would," I replied, taking a seat in the chair opposite her. "My arrogant brother-in-law thinks I am just a jealous failure scraping by on pennies. He left his laptop unlocked in the guest study because he believes his wealth makes him invincible." Valerie let out a bitter laugh without looking away from the screen. "That is exactly how they operate, Chloe. Men like Bradley build their entire empires on the assumption that women like us are too weak and too stupid to stop them." "He looked me dead in the eye 3 years ago," Valerie continued, her voice dropping to an angry whisper. "He told me a little girl from the wrong side of the tracks could never touch a corporate giant. He made sure the corrupt attorney general fired me the very next morning." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cold metal desk. "My father does the exact same thing," I said. "He uses his position as a highly respected church deacon to silence anyone who dares to question his authority. He told me dropping out of law school to preserve our cultural history was a pathetic waste of a life. He thinks my preservation degree is utterly useless." Valerie stopped typing for a fraction of a second and met my gaze. "Well, Chloe, tonight we are going to show them just how dangerous two underestimated women can truly be." She executed a complex decryption protocol. Lines of complex code cascaded down the black monitor like green rain. The military-grade software chewed through Bradley's basic corporate encryption barriers. "He uses standard, off-the-shelf security programs," Valerie scoffed, shaking her head in absolute disbelief. "He is moving millions of dollars of illicit funds, and he protects it with software you can buy at a generic electronics store. The arrogance is truly staggering." A loud chime echoed sharply in the small room. The screen flashed bright white, and a massive directory of hidden files snapped into sharp focus. We were in. "Open the main folder labeled Vanguard Y instructed," leaning much closer to the bright monitor. Valerie double-clicked the icon and a nested series of complex financial spreadsheets loaded onto the screen. We spent the next 2 hours meticulously tracing the digital paper trail. What we found defied all logical comprehension. The dark depths of their depravity went far beyond a few municipal zoning bribes or scattered predatory foreclosures. The $2 million I had found hidden inside the rotting wall of Elias Thompson's basement was nothing. It was literally just the petty cash they used to physically bribe low-level city inspectors and local construction foremen. Valerie opened a highly encrypted master routing file and gasped loudly. The color completely drained from her face. "Chloe, look at this routing number right here." She pointed a shaking finger at a recurring monthly transfer log. "This is an offshore account based in the Cayman Islands. And look closely at the originating source." I stared at the illuminated screen, my blood turning to solid ice in my veins. The originating source was the main charitable relief fund of my father's church, the exact fund designated exclusively to help struggling congregants pay their urgent medical bills and keep their family homes. My father was not just approving small financial transfers to help Bradley buy up local neighborhood debt. He was intentionally using the sacred church as a massive decentralized money laundering machine. Parishioners genuinely thought they were generously donating to uplift the vulnerable community. In reality, those untaxed religious donations were being funneled directly into dummy shell corporations completely controlled by Bradley. Bradley then used that clean, untraceable church money to secure massive commercial real estate loans. They had quietly moved nearly $40 million offshore in the last 3 years alone. And my father, the righteous patriarch who demanded absolute obedience and flawless perfection from everyone around him, was the primary architect of this entire financial slaughter. He was stealing the future of our community and hiding it behind the pulpit. The sheer magnitude of their betrayal settled over me like a suffocating blanket. My father was not just a hypocrite, he was the mastermind. I left Valerie's office with the encrypted drive hidden securely in my jacket. The next morning, I was boarding up a broken window when a sleek silver Mercedes pulled right onto my dying lawn. The passenger door swung open and my sister Serena stepped out. She wore a pristine white trench coat and oversized designer sunglasses, acting like she owned the very dirt beneath her expensive heels. A man in a flashy tailored suit hopped out of the driver's side holding a digital measuring tape and a thick roll of architectural blueprints. Serena did not even bother to knock on my door or acknowledge my presence on the porch. She pointed a manicured finger toward my front steps and started barking orders at the man. "I want the clubhouse entrance to face the street right where that rotting porch is," she dictated loudly, ensuring I heard every word. "The valet parking can wrap around the side, and we will put the infinity pool directly over that pathetic little basement." The designer nodded eagerly, taking notes on his digital tablet. I walked down the wooden steps, my boots crunching against the gravel. I crossed my arms and stared at her. "You are measuring my property for a clubhouse while there is an active federal injunction slapped on the front door?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. Serena lowered her sunglasses and looked at me with pure, unadulterated pity. "Oh, Chloe," she sighed dramatically. "You really think a piece of paper from some low-level federal clerk is going to stop Bradley? He is having dinner with the regional director of urban planning tonight. Your little injunction will be quietly dissolved by Friday. We are just getting a head start on the landscaping measurements. Time is money after all." I smiled. It was not a smile of defeat, but a smile of genuine amusement. "You are so confident in him, Serena. It is almost tragic. You truly believe you are an equal partner in his grand empire." She bristled, her posture stiffening immediately. "I am an equal partner," she snapped defensively. "Bradley and I share everything. We are building generational wealth. We are the definition of success in this city. You are bitter because you threw your life away on a useless degree while I secured a real future." "Generational wealth is a fascinating concept," I replied casually, taking a step closer to her. "Especially when that wealth is not even sitting in a domestic bank account. Has Bradley told you about his extracurricular financial activities lately?" Serena rolled her eyes. "I know all about his investments, Chloe. Do not try to play mind games with me." "Really?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "Then I assume you are fully aware of the Vanguard Trust." Her eyes darted away for a fraction of a second. She had absolutely no idea what Vanguard was, but her massive ego refused to let her admit ignorance. "Of course I know about Vanguard," she lied smoothly. "It is a highly exclusive investment portfolio. Bradley manages it perfectly." I let out a soft laugh. "A portfolio? Is that what he calls it?" "Serena, I am an independent researcher. I look into things for a living. Ask your highly successful husband why the Vanguard Trust requires offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. And ask him why millions in local church donations are suddenly being wired into those exact same offshore accounts." The designer stopped measuring and looked awkwardly between us. Serena turned bright red, her embarrassment quickly mutating into defensive rage. "You are insane," she hissed, stepping toward me. "You are making up desperate lies because you are losing this house. Bradley would never hide money from me, and he certainly would not steal from our father's church." "You are a sick, jealous woman." I held my ground, refusing to blink. "Federal agents love looking into offshore shell companies, Serena. When the asset freezes hit, they do not care whose name is on the marriage license. They take everything. The designer bags, the silver Mercedes, the luxury clubhouse. It all vanishes. You signed that severance document releasing me from the family liabilities. I am fully protected. But you are tied to him. When the feds knock on your door, do not say I did not warn you." Serena grabbed the designer's arm, her perfectly manicured fingers trembling slightly. "We are leaving," she ordered, her voice tight and breathless. "This toxic environment is ruining my creative vision." She threw herself into the passenger seat and slammed the door hard enough to rattle the windows. The silver Mercedes sped off, leaving thick tire tracks in my mud. I stood watching them disappear, knowing I had planted a seed of pure paranoia deep inside her fragile mind. Serena was arrogant, but she was not completely stupid. Her self-preservation instincts would eventually override her blind loyalty to a man who treated her like a trophy. Later that evening, the seed I planted violently took root. Serena sat alone in the massive garage of her luxury estate. Bradley was inside taking a business call behind the locked doors of his private study. He had been acting distant and agitated all week, snapping at her over minor inconveniences. My words about the Cayman Islands echoed relentlessly in her head. She opened the heavy door of Bradley's luxury SUV. She dug her fingers beneath the rubber lining of the center storage compartment. Her nails snagged on a folded piece of heavy paper. She pulled it out and smoothed the creases under the dim garage lighting. It was a physical bank statement. The logo read, Cayman National Bank. The account holder was listed as Vanguard Trust. The balance was over $12 million. Serena stared at the document, her hands shaking as the perfect illusion of her marriage completely shattered. The very next morning, the fallout from my calculated gamble materialized on my front porch. I was sitting at a folding table in my living room reviewing the architectural blueprints of the house when a heavy fist pounded against my front door. The wood rattled on its hinges. I glanced up at the smoke detector mounted directly above my head. Hidden inside the plastic casing was a high-definition wide-angle camera equipped with a military-grade audio receiver. Valerie and I had spent 3 hours wiring the entire house the previous night. I pressed a hidden button under the table to activate the recording system and walked to the door. I pulled the door open to find Bradley standing on my porch. The polished veneer of the untouchable corporate developer was completely gone. His tie was loosened, his eyes were bloodshot, and he gripped a heavy black leather duffel bag in his right hand. He shoved past me without an invitation, stepping into the dusty living room and kicking the door shut behind him with his heel. He threw the heavy bag onto my folding table. The metal zipper clanked loudly against the wood. "You have a very big mouth, Chloe," he snarled, pacing the small room like a caged animal. "Serena came crying to me last night, demanding to know what Vanguard is. She was hysterical. I had to spend 3 hours convincing my own wife that she was losing her mind and that you were just feeding her malicious lies to ruin our family. You are digging into things that do not concern you." I crossed my arms and leaned against the doorway. "They concern me when my father uses church funds to help you steal homes from vulnerable people," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Bradley stopped pacing. He let out a harsh, humorless laugh and ran a hand through his expensive hair. He walked over to the table and grabbed the zipper of the duffel bag. He yanked it open. Inside, tightly banded stacks of $100 bills filled the leather interior to the brim. The sheer volume of currency was staggering. "There is $1 million in untraceable cash sitting right there, Chloe," he said, his tone shifting from anger to a manipulative kind of bargaining. "It is entirely yours. You take this bag, you drop that pathetic federal historical injunction, and you get out of my city. You pack your bags tonight, and you never speak to Serena or your father again. You can take this money and go play historical savior in some other state." I looked at the mountain of cash and then looked back at him. "You are bribing me with the exact same money you stole from the congregation," I asked, keeping my posture relaxed. Bradley slammed his hands down on the table, leaning heavily over the cash. "I am offering you an exit strategy, you stupid girl," he hissed. "Do you honestly think you can stop progress with a useless heritage preservation degree? This neighborhood is dead. It has been dead for decades. Your ancestors' history means absolutely nothing to the people signing the checks today. You want to save a rotting wooden shack because some civil rights marchers slept here 90 years ago. No one cares, Chloe. History does not pay the bills. Luxury condos pay the bills. I am bringing real value to this city, and you are acting like a petulant child standing in front of a bulldozer. Take the $1 million and walk away before I crush you completely." I slowly walked over to the table and stared down at the money. I needed him to say the words. I needed the audio receiver in the ceiling to capture the exact mechanics of his corruption. I acted hesitant, letting my eyes linger on the cash. "If I drop the federal injunction, the local zoning board will just reinstate the emergency demolition order," I said, feigning uncertainty. "They will come after me for the municipal fines. How do I know the city will not seize this money the second I drop my legal protection? You control the local government, Bradley." If I surrender, you could just have them arrest me for tax evasion. Bradley threw his head back and laughed loudly. The sound was arrogant and full of supreme overconfidence. He took the bait perfectly. You really do not understand how the real world works, do you? He boasted, gesturing wildly with his hands. The city will not touch you because I own the city. You think those demolition orders were written by some independent safety inspector. I wrote them. I personally handed the head of the zoning board $300,000 in a briefcase just like this one to sign off on tearing down this entire block. I bought the mayor a vacation home in Aspen so he would fast-track my commercial permits. The municipal government works for me, Chloe. If I tell them to leave you alone, they will erase your name from their databases by noon. I am the one pulling the strings. You are just a minor glitch in my system. He smiled a predatory grin, completely convinced he had just asserted his absolute dominance. Now he demanded, shoving the duffel bag a few inches closer to me. Take the cash. Drop the injunction. We are done playing games. I reached out and ran my fingers lightly over the top stack of bills. I looked up at Bradley. His eyes were wide with desperate anticipation. I zipped the bag entirely shut and pushed it back across the table until it hit his chest. You are right about one thing, Bradley, I said, my voice dropping to an icy whisper. We are done playing games. But I do not want your dirty money, and I am not dropping the injunction. You can take this bag back to your offshore accounts because you are going to need every single cent to pay for your criminal defense lawyers. Bradley's face morphed into a mask of pure demonic rage. He grabbed the bag, his knuckles turning white. He leaned in so close I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. You are a dead woman walking, Chloe, he growled. I am going to destroy your life, and when I am finished, I will pave a parking lot over your grave. He spun around and stormed out of the house, slamming the front door so violently the entire structure shook. I stood perfectly still in the living room, listening to the roar of his luxury engine as he sped away. Once the street was quiet again, I looked up at the smoke detector mounted on the ceiling. A tiny green light blinked steadily from the plastic casing. I smiled. Bradley had just explicitly confessed to bribing the zoning board and the mayor of the city on a crystal-clear military-grade audio recording. I had the smoking gun. The next evening, I drove to the local community center. The parking lot was packed with luxury vehicles belonging to the developers and the aging sedans of the anxious local residents. Inside the stuffy gymnasium, the monthly zoning board meeting was already underway. The room was divided. On one side sat Bradley, his team of expensive lawyers, and the city planners he had already bought. On the other side sat the exhausted members of my community clutching their foreclosure notices and desperately hoping the board would hear their pleas. Sitting right in the front row next to Bradley was my father, Marcus. He was wearing his signature tailored charcoal suit, the one he always wore when he wanted to project quiet, unshakable moral authority. As the meeting progressed, he stood up and approached the podium, adjusting his posture to address the silent room. He spoke with the practiced cadence of a seasoned preacher. Members of the board. My father began, his voice resonating through the gymnasium. We must look to the future of this great city. Progress is rarely comfortable, but it is always necessary. The East Side has suffered from blight and neglect for too long. My son-in-law Bradley has presented a vision that will elevate us all, bringing jobs, modern infrastructure, and true economic revitalization. As a deacon of this community, I stand behind this development project completely. It is time to let go of the past and embrace the future. The board members nodded in solemn agreement. Several of Bradley's lawyers murmured their approval. I stood at the back of the room, gripping my thick manila folder until my knuckles turned white. It was time to shatter his perfectly curated illusion. I walked straight down the center aisle, my boots echoing loudly against the wooden floorboards. I object to this proposal, I said, my voice cutting through the stifling air. My father froze at the podium, his eyes widening in shock. Bradley bolted upright in his chair, his face instantly turning a deep shade of crimson. The head of the zoning board, an older man named Chairman Davis, frowned and tapped his gavel. Excuse me, miss, you are out of order. Public comments are scheduled for the end of the session. I am not a member of the public, Chairman Davis. I replied, marching directly up to the podium and standing right next to my father. I am the legal owner of the property at 405 Elm Street. The exact property this board flagged for emergency demolition last week without due process. My father recovered quickly, shifting instantly into his role as the concerned patriarch. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, trying to physically guide me away from the microphone. Chairman Davis, please excuse my daughter Marcus, said his voice dripping with condescending sympathy. Chloe has been struggling with some significant personal issues lately. She dropped out of law school and has been having a very difficult time finding her footing. She harbors a lot of misplaced jealousy toward her sister and her successful husband. She is just confused and upset. Please disregard this outburst. I shoved his hand off my shoulder so hard he stumbled backward. I am not confused, Marcus. I shot back, using his first name to strip away his parental authority in front of the entire room. I am a credentialed heritage preservationist, and I am here to formally notify this board that they are attempting to authorize the illegal demolition of a federally protected historical site. I slapped my thick manila folder onto the podium. I opened it and spread the documents out for the entire board to see. That block is not just a collection of old houses. It sits directly on top of the original foundation of the 1920s African American Civil Rights Coalition headquarters. I have the original surveyor maps, the historical deeds, and the federal injunction signed by a judge just 4 days ago. Chairman Davis leaned forward, his expression shifting from annoyance to genuine alarm. He adjusted his glasses and stared at the federal seal stamped on the top document. A federal injunction, he asked, his voice wavering slightly. Yes, I confirmed loudly, ensuring every resident in the back rows could hear me. The property is currently under a mandatory 90-day federal historical review. According to the National Historic Preservation Act, this zoning board has absolutely zero legal authority to approve any commercial development permits, demolish any structures, or rezone that specific grid until the federal review is completely finalized. If you stamp Bradley's permits tonight, you are all committing a federal offense. The room erupted into chaos. The local residents began cheering and clapping loudly, realizing that Bradley's unstoppable bulldozer had just slammed into a massive concrete wall. The zoning board members began whispering frantically among themselves, passing my documents back and forth down the long table. Bradley lost his mind. He leaped out of his chair and charged toward the podium, shoving past my father. "This is garbage!" he roared, his face contorted with rage. "She is making this up. That federal injunction is a fake. I have already paid for these permits." Chairman Davis slammed his gavel down repeatedly. "Mr. Bradley, sit down immediately. This board cannot and will not authorize any permits while a federal injunction is active. We are indefinitely tabling the East Side Development Project, pending the outcome of the historical review." "You cannot do this!" Bradley screamed, spit flying from his mouth. "I have millions of dollars tied up in these construction contracts. I need those permits stamped tonight." He lunged forward, reaching across the table to grab the documents. Chairman Davis stood up to block him. Bradley, blinded by absolute fury, grabbed the older man by the lapels of his suit and shoved him violently backward. Chairman Davis crashed into the wall behind the table, knocking over a row of municipal flags. The entire gymnasium gasped in collective horror. The 2 security guards stationed at the back of the room immediately sprinted down the aisle. They grabbed Bradley by the arms, pulling him away from the stunned board members. Bradley thrashed against their grip, screaming obscenities and threatening to sue every single person in the building. My father stood frozen near the podium, his face pale as he watched his golden son-in-law being physically restrained by municipal security. The pristine image of their righteous empire was completely shattered in front of the very community they were trying to rob. I looked at my father and smiled. "I told you history does not just get paved over," I whispered. "Sometimes it fights back." The silence in the gymnasium was absolute as the municipal security guards forcefully dragged Bradley out through the heavy double doors. I deliberately turned my back on my stunned father and walked out into the cool, refreshing night air. I knew I had easily won the initial battle, but the war was still far from over. My mother, Vivian, was definitely not a woman who accepted any form of public humiliation. If Bradley was the blunt physical force of our family empire, Vivian was the silent, creeping poison. She operated entirely in the shadows, using vicious whispers to systematically destroy anyone who threatened her perfect societal image. By the very next morning, her highly organized and ruthless elite smear campaign had already begun. I woke up to a harsh notification on my phone. My personal invitation to the annual County Heritage Gala had been abruptly and permanently revoked without any formal explanation. Hoping for a moment of peace, I decided to visit my favorite coffee shop located right in the center of town to clear my racing head. As I walked through the glass door, the lively conversations instantly stopped. People I had known for years suddenly stared at the floor. The entire community was deliberately turning its back on me. I sat at a corner table and opened my laptop. A close friend who worked at my mother's country club sent me a text message containing an audio clip. It was a recording of my mother speaking to wealthy socialites over brunch. I pressed play, holding the phone to my ear. Vivian's voice dripped with manufactured sorrow and fake maternal concern. "It breaks my heart to talk about it, Vivian," sighed dramatically. "Chloe has completely lost her grip on reality. Ever since she failed out of law school, her mental health has been in a severe downward spiral. She is fiercely jealous of Serena's beautiful marriage to Bradley. She has fabricated this entire fantasy about bribery and historical conspiracies just to ruin their happiness. We are trying to get her psychiatric help, but she refuses treatment. It is an absolute tragedy to watch her mind deteriorate." It was a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation. Vivian was weaponizing mental health stigmas to completely invalidate my credibility. By framing me as a jealous, unstable sibling, she made sure no one in her elite circles would ever believe my claims about the federal injunction or the Vanguard Trust. She was systematically cutting me off from the community, ensuring I had zero social support. The isolation was suffocating, but I refused to let her win. I reached out to the only people who valued objective truth over suburban gossip. My former professors from my heritage preservation program and the directors of the State Historical Archives. I sent them the full digital portfolio containing the blueprints, the civil rights movement documentation, and the architectural surveys of the neighborhood. I did not mention my mother's rumors at all. 3 days later, Vivian hosted the most anticipated social event of the season. It was the annual Golden Garden Luncheon held on the manicured lawns of the country club. This was her supreme domain, where she reigned as the undisputed queen of local high society. I knew she would use this exact event to cement her false narrative about my mental breakdown to the wealthiest donors and politicians in the city. I put on my best tailored suit and drove straight to the country club. Walking right beside me were Dr. Eris Thorne, the head of the National Historical Preservation Society, and Professor Evelyn Vance, a leading scholar on African American civil rights history. Behind them were 3 reporters from the state's most respected investigative journals. The security guards took one look at the press credentials and stepped aside. We walked onto the pristine green lawn, just as my mother was giving her keynote speech. She stood on a raised wooden platform, holding a crystal champagne flute, smiling radiantly at the crowd of wealthy socialites. She froze mid-sentence, the moment she saw me marching across the grass. Vivian recovered her fake smile and gripped the microphone. "Chloe, darling," she cooed, her voice echoing across the lawn. "This is a private event. You really need to go home and take your medication. We are all so worried about your mental state." I did not say a word. I simply stepped aside and let Dr. Thorne walk up to the edge of the platform. He was a man of immense academic prestige and commanded immediate respect in any room. He looked up at my mother with an expression of absolute disgust. "Mrs. Washington," Dr. Thorne said loudly, ensuring every single person at the luncheon could hear him clearly, "I cannot speak to your bizarre claims about your daughter's mental health. However, I am the preeminent historical authority in this state. I am here to publicly confirm that Chloe is 100% correct. The documents she uncovered regarding the East Side neighborhood are groundbreaking historical discoveries. We have officially fast-tracked federal protection status for the entire block, thanks to her brilliant research. The crowd erupted into shocked whispers. The fake smiles vanished from the faces of my mother's wealthy friends. Professor Vance stepped forward, holding up a leather portfolio. Furthermore, she announced, her voice ringing with authority. Chloe has brought to our attention the predatory demolition tactics employed by your son-in-law Bradley. We are drafting a formal letter of condemnation against his firm. We will be calling for a federal investigation into his aggressive attempts to erase protected civil rights landmarks. Vivian's champagne flute slipped from her manicured fingers and shattered against the wooden platform. The crystal shards scattered across the stage, perfectly mirroring the destruction of her carefully crafted social facade. The reporters raised their cameras, capturing every second of her humiliating public downfall. I looked up at Vivian. Her face was pale and her hands were violently shaking. The real war was just beginning. The immediate aftermath of the Golden Garden luncheon was a chaotic masterpiece of elite panic. My mother Vivian completely lost her composure, screaming at the country club staff to have me and my esteemed colleagues forcibly removed. The damage, however, was already irreversibly done. The three investigative reporters who had witnessed the entire spectacle wasted absolutely no time. By the time I returned to the safety of Valerie Hayes's secure apartment, my phone was buzzing relentlessly with news alerts. The local digital outlets were already publishing breaking stories about the historical significance of my property and the very public humiliation of the city's self-proclaimed queen of high society. But Valerie and I both knew that embarrassing my mother was merely a tactical diversion. The real target was Bradley and his illicit financial empire. We needed to strike a fatal blow to his corrupt operations before he could fully recover from the zoning board disaster. We sat in front of Valerie's encrypted computer servers, mapping out our next offensive maneuver. Bradley is arrogant, but he is highly adaptable, Valerie stated, her eyes scanning the complex network of offshore routing numbers we had extracted from the Vanguard ledger. He will try to leverage his political connections to suppress the historical preservation ruling. We need to cut off his oxygen supply. We need to choke his funding. I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The luxury condo project requires massive amounts of upfront capital. If we leak enough information to spook his primary investors, they will panic and pull their money before the feds even officially freeze his assets. Valerie smiled, a dangerous, predatory smile. Exactly. We are going to feed a very hungry shark. We spent the next 4 hours meticulously compiling a highly redacted dossier. We carefully selected specific documents from the stolen hard drive that outlined the shady financial transfers between the church's charitable fund and Bradley's local development accounts. We deliberately scrubbed all names, dates, and explicit identifying markers. We only left enough breadcrumbs to verify the authenticity of the documents and to strongly hint at a massive systemic fraud operation occurring right under the city's nose. We needed to create a narrative so explosive that the local media could not ignore it, but vague enough to protect our ongoing federal investigation. Using a secured, untraceable encrypted email server, we sent the redacted dossier directly to Marcus Reed. He was the most aggressive and relentless investigative journalist at the city's leading independent news outlet. Marcus had built his entire career on exposing municipal corruption, and Bradley had been his elusive white whale for years. He is going to salivate over this, Valerie muttered, hitting the send button with a decisive click. The sheer volume of unexplained cash flow is enough to trigger a full-scale media frenzy. We did not have to wait long for the explosion. Less than 48 hours later, the independent news outlet dropped a bombshell investigative report that sent shockwaves through the city's financial district. The headline screamed across every screen: "Municipal millions missing, anonymous leak exposes massive development fraud linked to prominent local builder." The article did not name Bradley directly, but the implications were unmistakably clear. It detailed a sophisticated scheme involving shell companies, predatory lending practices, and the suspicious diversion of local charitable funds into private development projects. The journalist brilliantly highlighted the exact geographical area of Bradley's proposed luxury condo development, connecting the dots between the sudden spike in aggressive foreclosures and the massive influx of unaccounted capital. The impact was instantaneous and utterly devastating. The elite financial ecosystem that Bradley relied upon to fund his lavish projects operates entirely on perception and stability. The moment the article hit the digital newsstands, that stability vanished. Bradley's primary investors, a consortium of wealthy regional venture capitalists who demanded absolute discretion and clean ledgers, panicked. They saw the glaring red flags of federal scrutiny looming over the project. I sat in my living room watching the local news coverage unfold with grim satisfaction. The television showed footage of Bradley's corporate headquarters downtown. News vans were parked aggressively along the curb, reporters shouting questions at any employee attempting to enter or exit the building. My phone buzzed with an incoming text from my source within the city planning department. "It's a bloodbath," the message read. "3 major investors just pulled their funding commitments for the East Side project. Bradley's firm is hemorrhaging cash. They can't even cover the payroll for the demolition crews." The anonymous leak had achieved its exact objective. By exposing the financial irregularities, we had triggered a catastrophic cash flow crisis for Bradley's company. He was heavily overleveraged, relying entirely on the continuous influx of investor capital to sustain his corrupt operations and maintain his lavish lifestyle. Without that money, the luxury gentrification project was completely paralyzed. He could not bribe zoning officials, he could not pay his private security contractors, and he certainly could not afford the aggressive legal teams needed to fight my historical preservation injunction. The impenetrable fortress of his wealth was rapidly crumbling, exposing the fragile, fraudulent foundation beneath it. But the most satisfying consequence was the chaos it unleashed within my family. My mother, still reeling from the humiliation at the country club, was now desperately trying to manage the fallout from the news report. She spent her days frantically calling her remaining social contacts, spinning increasingly absurd lies about a vast left-wing conspiracy designed to tear down successful families. My father, Marcus, retreated into a stony, terrified silence. He knew that the leaked documents, even redacted, pointed directly toward his church accounts. The righteous facade he had spent decades building was cracking, revealing the terrified, corrupt man hiding behind the pulpit. And then there was Serena, my golden child sister, whose entire identity was entirely dependent on her husband's perceived wealth and power, was suddenly thrust into a nightmare she could not comprehend or control. The offshore bank statement she had discovered in Bradley's SUV, combined with the explosive news report, finally shattered her arrogant delusion. She could no longer deny the ugly reality of the man she had married or the fragile, fraudulent nature of the empire she so proudly flaunted. The financial crisis was not just destroying Bradley's business, it was tearing apart their marriage. The stage was perfectly set for the inevitable violent collision between the two people who had so eagerly plotted my destruction. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the massive foyer of Serena and Bradley's mansion. Serena had thrown a crystal vase, a wedding gift from a prominent state senator, directly at Bradley's head. He ducked the vase, exploding against the custom-painted wall behind him. The news report had been live for less than 6 hours, and the carefully constructed illusion of their perfect marriage was already disintegrating. "You lied to me!" Serena screamed, her voice cracking with a mix of fury and genuine terror. She stood in the center of the foyer, holding the printed Cayman National Bank statement she had found in his SUV. $12 million, Bradley. $12 million sitting in an offshore account while you were telling me we needed to delay paying the contractors for the East Side project. And the article, it's about you, isn't it? The missing church funds, the shell companies. It's all you. Bradley straightened his suit jacket, his face a mask of cold, calculated indifference. He did not yell, he did not apologize. He stepped over the broken glass, closing the distance between them with slow, measured steps. "Keep your voice down, Serena," he ordered, his tone flat and dangerous. "The staff can hear you." "I don't care who hears me," she shrieked, waving the bank statement in his face. "Are you stealing from my father's church? Are you laundering money? Is that why my sister was so confident when she told me the feds were going to seize everything? Bradley snatched the paper from her hand, his grip tight enough to crumple the thick cardstock. He looked down at his wife, his eyes devoid of any warmth or affection. Your sister is a delusional, jealous failure who is currently having a mental breakdown. Your mother already confirmed this to the entire country club. That article is a hit piece planted by rival developers trying to capitalize on her insane historical injunction. And this, he shook the bank statement, is a private corporate asset reserve. It is entirely legal, heavily encrypted, and absolutely none of your business. He stepped closer, backing Serena against the marble staircase. You wanted the mansion, didn't you? You wanted the designer clothes, the VIP tables, the ability to look down your nose at your sister and everyone else who didn't measure up to your standard of black excellence. Well, this is how that lifestyle is funded. You don't get to enjoy the empire and then play the victim when you see how the sausage is made. You used my father, she cried, her back pressed hard against the banister. Your father used himself, Bradley countered smoothly, a cruel smile playing on his lips. Marcus is a grown man. He knew exactly what he was signing when he authorized those transfers. We are partners, Serena. He wanted the prestige of funding a massive development project, and I provided the vehicle. We are uplifting this community. By stealing from it. By doing what is necessary, Bradley snapped. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging painfully into her skin. Now listen to me very carefully. You are going to pull yourself together. You are going to host the charity gala on Sunday looking perfect and completely unbothered. You will not speak of this again. If you panic, if you break rank, you will lose everything. The house, the cars, your social standing, all of it vanishes. Do you understand me? Before Serena could answer, the heavy front doors swung open. Marcus walked in, having used his private key code. He stopped, taking in the scene, the broken glass, Bradley gripping Serena's arm, his daughter's tear-streaked face. Dad? Serena gasped, pulling her arm free and running toward him. Dad, the article is true. He has an offshore account. He's using the church funds. We have to stop him before the FBI. Marcus did not embrace her. He did not comfort his daughter. He looked at Bradley, then at Serena, his face set in stone. Stop him, Marcus asked, his voice chillingly calm. Serena, do you have any idea how much money is tied up in the East Side project? We are days away from finalizing the zoning board appeals. We cannot afford any distractions right now. Serena stopped dead in her tracks. She stared at her father, the righteous deacon, the man who had always placed her on a pedestal above Chloe. You knew, she whispered, the horrifying realization washing over her. You knew he was stealing the donations. You helped him. I secured our family's future, Marcus corrected her sharply. I ensured that we remain at the absolute pinnacle of this community. Bradley is handling the temporary cash flow issue caused by that ridiculous news leak. You need to stand by your husband, Serena. Do not let Chloe's psychotic jealousy tear this family apart. He was choosing the empire over her safety. He was choosing the money over the truth. Marcus walked past his weeping daughter, clapping Bradley on the shoulder. We need to talk about damage control, he said to his son-in-law, completely ignoring Serena as the two men walked into the private study and closed the door. Serena stood alone in the foyer, surrounded by the shattered remains of the crystal vase. The truth was undeniable now. Chloe had been right about everything. Bradley was a criminal, their father was his willing accomplice, and the entire foundation of their elite lifestyle was built on fraud. She knew deep down that she should call Chloe. She knew she should ally with her sister, turn over the bank statement, and help bring them down before she was indicted as a co-conspirator. But as she looked around the magnificent multi-million-dollar foyer, a darker, more powerful instinct took over. Pride. If she admitted Chloe was right, she would have to admit that her entire life was a lie. She would have to step down from her pedestal. She would lose the wealth, the status, the envy of her peers. She could not bear the thought of becoming the very thing she had always mocked Chloe for, being a woman with nothing. Serena wiped her tears, her jaw setting with stubborn, terrified determination. She would not lose her empire. She would play the part, host the gala, and pretend everything was perfect. She would go down with the ship before she ever asked her sister for a life raft. I returned to the safety of my heavily secured house, completely exhausted but practically buzzing with adrenaline. The anonymous leak had worked flawlessly, creating an intense, immediate financial crisis for Bradley and throwing the elite social circles into absolute, unmitigated chaos. I knew my father Marcus would not take this lightly. He was a man who built his entire life on the perception of absolute control and moral authority. To see his carefully curated empire cracking under the weight of an anonymous leak would drive him to desperate measures. The knock on my door came precisely at 2 in the morning. It was not a frantic pounding like Bradley's, but a steady, authoritative rap that commanded immediate attention. I checked the hidden security camera feed on my phone. Marcus stood on the porch alone, dressed in a long, dark overcoat, his face shadowed by the brim of a fedora. He looked less like a respected deacon and more like an old-school mob boss arriving to settle a debt. I unlocked the door and stepped back, allowing him to enter. He did not remove his hat or offer a greeting. He walked slowly into the center of my living room, taking in the sparse, dusty surroundings with a look of profound disgust. "You have caused a tremendous amount of unnecessary trouble, Chloe," he began, his voice echoing in the empty space. "Your mother is practically bedridden with embarrassment, and Bradley's investors are demanding answers. You have managed to be a nuisance, I will give you that. But a nuisance is all you are." I crossed my arms, refusing to let his physical presence intimidate me. "I assume you didn't come here at 2 in the morning just to critique my interior decorating skills, Marcus." He ignored my use of his first name, pacing slowly across the room. "I came here to give you one final opportunity to rectify your massive mistake. You are going to withdraw that ridiculous federal historical preservation claim tomorrow morning. You will release a public statement citing a clerical error in your research, and you will sign the deed of this property over to Bradley's holding company. And if I refuse..." Marcus stopped pacing and turned to face me, his eyes cold and calculating. "If you refuse, I will personally ensure that you never work in the field of historical preservation in this state or any surrounding state ever again. I sit on the board of 3 major university endowments and 4 historical societies. I can make one phone call and ensure your grants are permanently frozen, your research is discredited, and your professional reputation is entirely ruined. You will be blacklisted. You will have no career, no money, and no future." He stepped closer, towering over me, his voice dropping to a harsh, lecturing tone. "You think you are being righteous, Chloe. You think you are saving this neighborhood, but you understand absolutely nothing about power. Building an empire requires making difficult choices. It requires stepping on the weak to elevate the strong. Do you think I became a respected leader in this community by playing fair and holding the hands of the impoverished?" He let out a short, bitter laugh. "The people in this neighborhood are weak. They are poor, uneducated, and easily manipulated. If Bradley doesn't take their land, someone else will. The strong survive by accumulating resources, and the weak perish by clinging to sentimentality. I am securing generational wealth for our family. I am ensuring that your sister, my grandchildren, and my legacy remain untouchable. I will not let your naive, pathetic crusade for a rotting wooden shack destroy what I have built." I stared at the man who had raised me. The mask of the benevolent community leader had completely slipped, revealing the ruthless, corrupt architect underneath. He genuinely believed that his wealth and status justified his absolute cruelty. He thought his power was absolute. "You talk a lot about building empires, Marcus," I said, my voice eerily calm. "But you forgot the most important rule of architecture. If the foundation is rotten, the entire structure will inevitably collapse." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. "You think you can threaten my career? You think you can blacklist me? You have absolutely no idea what you are actually dealing with." I opened the encrypted audio file Valerie had isolated from the Vanguard USB drive. I held the phone up, ensuring the speaker was pointing directly at him. I pressed play. The pristine audio recording filled the quiet living room. "I am handling it, Bradley. I have already approved the transfers from the church charity account. We are using the congregation donations to buy up the remaining debt portfolios of those holdouts. Once the church officially holds their loans, I will personally visit them and explain that the church simply cannot afford to extend their grace period. They will sign over their deeds voluntarily out of shame. I pressed pause. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Marcus stood frozen, his face rapidly draining of all color. His eyes darted from the phone to my face wide with a sudden profound terror. The authoritative posture collapsed, his shoulders slumping as the reality of the recording hit him. Where did you get that?" He stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The confident mob boss was gone. The terrified, exposed fraud remained. I smiled, a cold, empty expression. "You thought I was just a failure scraping by on pity grants, remember? You thought I had no power, no money, and no influence. You severely underestimated me, Marcus." I took a step toward him, forcing him to step back. "You use the church's charity fund's money, meant for the sick, the elderly, the desperate, to finance Bradley's luxury condos. You weaponize their faith against them. And I have the master ledger that proves every single illicit transfer you made to the Cayman Islands. I have the audio, the routing numbers, and the offshore account statements." Marcus raised a shaking hand, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Chloe, please. You don't understand the complexity of those transfers. I can explain. We can make a deal. I will give you whatever you want. I will buy this property for double its value. I will fund your preservation projects." "I don't want your blood money," I stated flatly. "You came here tonight to deliver an ultimatum, Marcus. But you don't dictate the terms anymore. I do. And my terms are very simple. Get out of my house." He stared at me, his eyes pleading desperately, searching for the compliant daughter he used to bully and control. He found nothing but cold, absolute resolve. He turned slowly and walked out the front door, his steps heavy and slow. I watched him walk down the path to his car, a broken, terrified man, whose empire was officially burning to the ground. The night of the charity gala arrived, draped in the kind of excessive manufactured opulence that only the truly guilty require. The Grand Magnolia Ballroom was a sea of crystal silk and whispered secrets. This was the social event of the year, the glittering stage where Bradley intended to publicly resurrect his crumbling empire, and where my parents planned to reassert their dominance over the city's elite. I arrived precisely an hour after the doors opened, wearing a sharply tailored midnight blue suit that radiated absolute unyielding power. I bypassed the red carpet and walked straight through the main entrance, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. The atmosphere in this ballroom shifted the exact moment I crossed the threshold. Heads turned, conversations faltered, and a ripple of shocked whispers swept through the crowd. I was the disgraced daughter, the alleged mental patient, the pariah who had supposedly tried to destroy her own family out of pure jealousy. And yet here I was, walking into their sacred inner sanctum as if I owned the building. My mother Vivian spotted me from across the room. She was wearing a custom emerald gown, holding court near the main stage with a group of local politicians. Her face instantly contorted with absolute fury. She abandoned her conversation and marched toward me, her heels stabbing the floor like daggers. She signaled two massive security guards who flanked the entrance. "Remove her immediately," Vivian hissed to the guards, pointing a trembling manicured finger at my chest. She lowered her voice to a vicious whisper, ensuring the nearby guests could not hear. "You have lost your mind, Chloe. How dare you show your face here after the embarrassment you caused this family? This is a private ticketed event for the city's most generous benefactors. You are trespassing, and you are leaving right now before I have you arrested." The security guards stepped forward, their expressions unreadable, hands reaching to grab my arms. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I calmly reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a heavy embossed gold envelope. "I wouldn't touch me if I were you," I said, my voice carrying the icy authority of a woman holding all the cards. I handed the envelope directly to the head of security. "I am not trespassing, Vivian. I am the primary sponsor of Table 1, the VIP table situated directly in front of the main stage." My mother stared at me, her eyes wide with frantic confusion. That is impossible. Table 1 was purchased by an anonymous offshore trust. Yes. I smiled a slow, predatory expression. The Vanguard Accountability Trust. I set it up last week using a proxy. I paid $50,000 for that table, Vivian. The money has already cleared, so unless you want to publicly eject your highest paying donor in front of the mayor and the entire city council, I suggest you tell your goons to back off. The security guard examined the gold ticket, verified the authenticity, and stepped away, nodding respectfully to me. Vivian looked as though she had been physically struck. Her carefully constructed reality was buckling under the weight of my presence. She realized in that terrifying moment that I had resources and connections she could not comprehend or control. "You are playing a very dangerous game, Chloe," she whispered, her voice shaking with suppressed rage. "I'm not playing a game, Mother," I replied, stepping past her. "I am ending one." I walked to table 1 and took my seat. The chairs around me remained empty, a stark, deliberate statement. I sat alone in the very center of their elite universe, sipping sparkling water and waiting for the final act to begin. Up on the main stage, the orchestra finished its set and the lights dimmed. The room fell silent as Marcus and Bradley walked to the podium. My father wore his deacon's robes over a bespoke suit projecting the image of holy prosperity. Bradley stood beside him, looking smug and entirely untouchable. He believed he had weathered the storm. He believed his investors would return once he publicly crushed my historical preservation claim tonight. Marcus delivered a booming, hypocritical sermon about charity, community resilience, and the divine right of progress. He praised Bradley as a visionary builder, a man chosen to elevate the city from the ashes of decay. The congregation applauded, willfully ignorant of the poison flowing through their pews. Then Bradley took this microphone. He adjusted his tie, his eyes scanning the crowd before locking directly onto me. A cruel, arrogant smile spread across his face. He saw me sitting alone at table 1, and he misinterpreted my presence. He thought my anonymous donation was a desperate peace offering. He thought I had finally cracked under the pressure of the smear campaign and the financial ruin he had threatened me with. He thought I was there to surrender. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bradley announced, his voice echoing through the massive ballroom, "tonight is about unity. It is about family overcoming adversity. We have faced challenges recently, malicious rumors, and unfortunate misunderstandings. But tonight, we move forward." He pointed directly at me, the spotlight shifting to illuminate my table. "My sister-in-law Chloe is here with us tonight. She has been struggling, but she has finally seen the light. She understands that true progress requires sacrifice. Chloe, please come up to the stage." The entire ballroom turned to look at me. The silence was deafening. Bradley was attempting to force my hand, intending to publicly coerce me into handing over the property rights in front of the community, framing it as a touching moment of familial reconciliation. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. I stood up, slowly smoothing the jacket of my suit. I did not look defeated. I looked like a woman walking to an execution, and I was holding the blade. I walked up the velvet-lined steps and took my place at the podium, standing between the two men who had destroyed so many lives. Bradley handed me the microphone, his eyes silently demanding my submission. He expected a surrender. He was about to get a slaughter. I stepped up to the podium, the bright stage lights momentarily blinding me. Bradley stood to my right, his chest puffed out, radiating an unbearable, arrogant confidence. My father, Marcus, stood to my left, his hands clasped piously in front of him, the very picture of a benevolent patriarch. The massive ballroom was utterly silent, hundreds of the city's most powerful and influential people hanging on my every word. I looked out into the crowd. I saw my mother Vivian sitting rigidly at a table near the front, her face a mask of forced, strained politeness. I saw Serena looking pale and terrified, her eyes darting nervously toward the exits. Bradley leaned in his heavy cologne, briefly overpowering the scent of the floral arrangements on the stage. He held the microphone out to me, a cruel, triumphant glint in his eye. "Go ahead, Chloe," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the sound system. "Tell them how much you believe in our vision. Tell them you are ready to let go of the past." I took the microphone from his hand, my grip steady and firm. I did not look at him. I looked directly out into the sea of expectant faces. "Thank you, Bradley," I said, my voice ringing out clear and strong, echoing through the cavernous ballroom. "And thank you to my family for bringing me up here tonight. This is truly a momentous occasion, a night dedicated to legacy, to community, and to the future of our city." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. The silence was absolute. My father, Deacon Marcus Washington, has always taught me the importance of a strong foundation. He taught me that an empire must be built on truth, on integrity, and on unwavering faith. I turned my head slightly, catching my father's eye. He smiled, a practiced, hollow expression that did not reach his eyes. "And my brother-in-law Bradley has shown me what ambition truly looks like. He has shown me the lengths to which a man will go to secure his legacy, to leave his mark on the world." Bradley nodded graciously, accepting the praise he believed he was due. He thought I was playing my part perfectly. He thought he had broken me. But over the past few weeks, I continued turning my attention back to the audience. I have learned that legacy is a complicated concept. It is not just about the buildings we construct or the wealth we accumulate. It is about the methods we employ. It is about the people we uplift, and more importantly, the people we destroy along the way. A subtle murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not the standard congratulatory speech they were expecting. Vivian shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her forced smile beginning to falter. "I have spent my career fighting to preserve the history of our community," I stated, my voice gaining volume and intensity. "I have fought to protect the homes and the stories of the vulnerable, the marginalized, the people who built this city with their sweat and their sacrifice. And recently, I uncovered a story that desperately needs to be told. A story that exposes the very foundation of the empire we are supposedly celebrating tonight." I turned my head slightly and made a subtle prearranged hand signal toward the AV booth at the back of the room. Valerie Hayes, my brilliant, relentless accomplice, was waiting. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice cutting through the growing unease in the ballroom like a scythe, "I present to you the true legacy of Bradley's empire, the true foundation of my father's church." Behind me, the massive state-of-the-art LED screens, which had previously displayed pristine architectural renderings of the luxury condo development, suddenly flickered. The images of gleaming glass towers and manicured green spaces vanished. The screens went entirely black for a fraction of a second before a new image snapped into sharp, high-resolution focus. It was a spreadsheet, a complex, meticulously detailed financial ledger. At the top of the screen, in bold, unmistakable letters, were the words "Vanguard Trust, Offshore Account." A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. Bradley whipped around, staring at the screen in absolute horror. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking ashen and terrified. Marcus stumbled backward, his hand flying to his chest as if he had been physically struck. "What is this?" Bradley stammered, his voice raw with panic. He grabbed the edge of the podium, his knuckles turning white. "Turn it off! Cut the feed!" He looked desperately toward the AV booth, but Valerie had already locked the system. The images were not going anywhere. "As you can clearly see," I continued, my voice calm, projecting absolute control over the ensuing chaos, "this is not an architectural rendering. This is a bank statement. A statement detailing a $12 million balance held in the Cayman Islands." I raised my hand, and the image on the screen shifted. A new document appeared, this one displaying a series of wire transfers. "And these," I announced, pointing toward the screen, "are the wire transfers, millions of dollars systematically and deliberately funneled into that offshore account." The murmurs in the crowd had escalated into shocked, angry shouts. People were standing up, pointing at the screens, their faces contorted with disbelief and outrage. I turned my attention to the front row, looking directly at the prominent church members and local politicians who had gathered to celebrate their benevolent leaders. "Take a close look at the originating source of those transfers," I instructed the crowd, my voice echoing over the growing uproar. "You will see that the money did not come from Bradley's legitimate business accounts. It came directly from the main charitable relief fund of the church, the fund managed by my father, The money you donated to help the poor, the sick, and the vulnerable was stolen, laundered, and used to finance a luxury real estate development. The ballroom erupted. The sheer scale of the betrayal, the brazen audacity of the fraud, hit the audience like a physical blow. The legacy they were celebrating was a lie. The men they admired were criminals, and the woman they had dismissed and ridiculed was the one holding the spotlight, illuminating the darkest corners of their corrupt empire. The uproar in the ballroom was not merely noise, it was a physical force, a tidal wave of betrayal crashing against the glittering walls of the Grand Magnolia. Men in expensive tuxedos and women in designer gowns stood up, knocking over crystal champagne flutes and silver centerpieces. The illusion of high society elegance evaporated in a single second, replaced by raw, visceral outrage. Bradley scrambled backward on the stage. His perfectly tailored suit suddenly looked like a cheap costume. He frantically waved his arms at the audiovisual booth at the back of the room, screaming orders that were completely drowned out by the fury of the crowd. He demanded they cut the feed. He demanded they shut the screens down. But Valerie had locked the entire digital system behind military-grade encryption walls. The images of the Cayman Islands' bank accounts remained brightly illuminated for the entire city to witness. He lunged toward me, trying to snatch the microphone from my hands, but I smoothly stepped out of his reach. I did not break eye contact with the audience. I raised my hand one final time, delivering the signal Valerie had been waiting for. The visual evidence on the massive LED screens was damning enough. But I wanted them to hear the unvarnished truth. I wanted the elite of this city to hear the exact tone of voice my father used when he sold his soul and betrayed his flock. The music speakers positioned in every corner of the grand ballroom crackled to life. The state-of-the-art surround sound system, which Bradley had personally paid to upgrade to ensure his own speeches sounded majestic, became the instrument of his absolute destruction. The clear, undeniable voice of my father echoed through the cavernous space. "I have already approved the transfers from the church charity account." Marcus's recorded voice boomed, chillingly casual and dripping with arrogance. "We are using the congregation donations to buy up the remaining debt portfolios of those holdouts. Once the church officially holds their loans, I will personally visit them and explain that the church simply cannot afford to extend their grace period. They will sign over their deeds voluntarily out of shame." A collective gasp of pure horror sucked all the oxygen out of the room. Then came Bradley's recorded response, echoing from the speakers with sickening clarity. "You are a genius, Marcus. Using the church funds to finance my condo project while making the congregation think you are trying to help them is brilliant work. The new transfer should cover the rest of the council bribes." The reaction from the audience was apocalyptic. These were the very people who had blindly trusted my father. Elderly parishioners who had donated a portion of their fixed incomes to help their struggling neighbors were weeping openly, clutching their chests in shock. Local business owners who had vouched for Marcus's integrity were shouting curses, their faces red with righteous anger. The sheer depravity of the scheme, using faith as a weapon to steal generational homes, shattered any remaining shred of decorum. The crowd was ready to tear the stage apart. I looked down at table 1, right in the center of the chaos. My mother Vivian was experiencing the ultimate manifestation of her worst nightmares. The elite social circle she had sacrificed her own daughter to protect was physically retreating from her. The mayor and his wife, who had been sitting at her table, stood up and backed away quickly as if Vivian were highly contagious. Vivian clutched her throat, her face drained of all color. The emerald gown she wore suddenly looked heavy and suffocating. She let out a guttural, humiliated wail and collapsed back into her chair. She buried her face in her manicured hands, physically trying to hide from the hundreds of judging eyes bearing down on her. Her empire of status and prestige was burning to ash in front of the entire city. A few tables over, my sister Serena stood paralyzed. She stared at the man she married and the father she worshipped, watching them burn in the spotlight. She had chosen the illusion of wealth over the truth, and now she was watching that illusion violently evaporate. She grabbed her designer purse and tried to push her way toward the exit, desperately attempting to flee the sinking ship, but the crowd was too dense. She was trapped in the wreckage. On the stage, Marcus had completely shut down. The righteous, booming deacon had vanished. He sank to his knees on the polished wooden floor of the stage, his hands trembling violently as he stared blankly out at the furious congregation. He was muttering panicked, incoherent prayers, but God was certainly not listening to him tonight. Bradley, however, did not surrender. When a narcissist realizes his absolute power is gone, he does not reflect on his actions. He attacks. He turned toward me, his face contorted into a mask of pure demonic rage. The veins in his neck bulged and his eyes were wide with primal violence. He realized that the quiet, dismissed preservationist he had bullied and mocked had meticulously engineered his total annihilation. I had taken his money, his reputation, and his freedom, and I had done it while wearing a tailored suit on his own stage. "You ruined everything!" Bradley roared, his voice cracking with hysteria. "I will kill you!" He lunged across the stage, throwing his entire body weight toward me, with his hands outstretched, aiming directly for my throat. I did not flinch. I did not even step back. I simply watched him fall. Before Bradley could close the distance between us, a massive wall of solid muscle intercepted him. The head of security, the same man whose gold envelope I had verified earlier, tackled Bradley around the waist. The sheer force of the impact sent both men crashing hard into the podium. The wooden stand splintered, sending the microphone and expensive floral arrangements flying across the stage floor. Bradley thrashed and screamed, fighting wildly against the security guard. Two more guards rushed the stage, pinning Bradley's arms behind his back and driving his face forcefully into the polished wood. His expensive suit tore at the shoulder, his perfect hair slicked to his forehead with nervous sweat. He writhed like a trapped animal, spitting curses at me, at Marcus, at the entire room. I stood perfectly still, watching the tyrant bleed out his last ounces of authority. The screaming in the ballroom suddenly shifted in pitch. The chaotic outrage transformed into a different kind of shock. People near the back of the hall began to part, creating a wide, clear path down the center aisle. I looked past the struggling developer pinned to the floor and the weeping deacon on his knees. I looked past my mother, who was still cowering behind her hands. The heavy brass-handled main doors of the Grand Magnolia Ballroom burst open with a resounding crash. The heavy velvet curtains were aggressively pushed aside. Piercing the dim, luxurious lighting of the gala were the unmistakable, blinding flashes of brilliant red and blue lights reflecting off the crystal chandeliers. Heavily armed federal agents poured into the room, their badges gleaming against their tactical vests. The final curtain was falling. The heavy brass doors of the Grand Magnolia Ballroom had not merely been opened, they were breached with tactical precision. The flashing red and blue lights sliced through the opulence, casting frantic, strobing shadows across the crystal chandeliers and the terrified faces of the city's elite. Over a dozen federal agents clad in dark windbreakers, emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the FBI, swarmed into the cavernous room. Their presence was overwhelming, a sudden injection of harsh reality into a space constructed entirely on illusions. The music had stopped long ago, replaced by the chaotic symphony of shouted commands, panicked gasps, and the sharp clatter of tactical boots against the polished marble floor. "Nobody move!" The lead agent's voice cut through the pandemonium like a whip. "Federal Bureau of Investigation, keep your hands visible and step away from the stage." The crowd parted instantly, creating a wide, terrified berth for the advancing agents. The city's power brokers, the politicians, the wealthy donors, they all shrank back, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive epicenter of the scandal. They watched in stunned silence as the agents rapidly ascended the velvet-lined stairs of the main stage. Bradley was still pinned to the wooden floor by the security guards, his expensive tuxedo torn, and his face flushed with a mixture of exertion and profound terror. Two federal agents moved in swiftly, taking control. They hauled Bradley to his feet forcefully, twisting his arms behind his back. The sharp, unmistakable click of metal handcuffs echoing across the stage was a sound I had anticipated for weeks. It was the sound of absolute finality. "Bradley Vance," the lead agent declared, his voice carrying clearly over the hushed crowd. You are under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit federal offenses. You have the right to remain silent." Bradley thrashed against the agent's grip, his eyes wide and wild. He looked down at the crowd, searching for an ally, searching for anyone who still believed in his invincible facade. He found nothing but horrified stares. He looked at me standing calmly near the edge of the stage, and the raw, impotent rage in his expression was a testament to his total defeat. He opened his mouth perhaps to hurl one final threat, but an agent shoved him forward, cutting him off before he could speak. Beside him, my father Marcus had not moved. He was still on his knees, his deacon's robes pooling around him like a deflated parachute. He looked incredibly small, a hollowed-out shell of the righteous patriarch he had portrayed just moments before. Two agents approached him, their expressions stoic and unyielding. They did not yank him to his feet. They simply gripped his upper arms and hauled him up. Marcus offered no resistance. He extended his wrists submissively, his head bowed in absolute disgrace, as the cold steel closed around his wrists. "Marcus Washington," another agent intoned, reading him his rights. The sight of my father, the man who had demanded perfection and obedience, being led away in handcuffs should have elicited some complex emotional response. But I felt nothing. The man being arrested was a stranger, a corrupt architect of his own demise. The ballroom was entirely consumed by the spectacle of the arrests. The flashing lights, the authoritative commands, the sheer, undeniable reality of the consequences. It was a flawless, devastating conclusion to the empire they had built. Suddenly, a frantic commotion broke out near table 1. Serena, her immaculate gown now wrinkled and her perfect makeup ruined by streaks of mascara, shoved her way through the retreating crowd. She stumbled toward the stage, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate energy. She did not run to Bradley. She did not run to our father. She ran directly to me. "Chloe!" Serena gasped, grabbing my arm with trembling hands. Her grip was tight, bordering on painful. "Chloe, please, you have to help us. You have to stop this." I looked down at her. The arrogant, condescending sister who had mocked me, who had told me I belonged in the slums, was completely gone. In her place was a terrified, desperate woman whose entire identity was currently being escorted out the back doors in handcuffs. "Stop this," I asked, my voice dangerously calm, effortlessly removing her hand from my arm. "I didn't start this, Serena. Your husband did, and your father helped him." "But the money!" she cried, the desperation escalating into hysteria. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "The $2 million you found in the walls. You still have it, right? You have to use it. We need the best defense lawyers in the country. We need to post bail. Please, Chloe, you have to use that money to save the family." I stared at her, genuinely astounded by the sheer audacity of her request. She was begging me to use the very bribe money that Bradley had stolen from our community, the money he had intended to use to bulldoze my house to pay for their legal defense. She was demanding that I, the sister she had relentlessly abused and dismissed, become their savior. I did not yell. I did not express anger. I simply smiled, a cold, empty expression that made Serena flinch. I reached slowly into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I bypassed my phone and pulled out a neatly folded, thick manila envelope. I opened it and slowly extracted a heavy legal document printed on premium cardstock. I held it up, ensuring the bright stage lights illuminated the bold black text at the top of the page. Serena's eyes darted to the document, confusion rapidly replacing the desperation on her face. She recognized the paper. She recognized the elegant, hurried signature slashed across the bottom line. It was her signature. "Do you remember what this is, Serena?" I asked, my voice carrying a lethal, quiet authority. "You signed it at the coffee shop. You and Mom and Marcus. You were all so eager to sign it, terrified that my inevitable bankruptcy would ruin your precious social standing." Serena stared at the document, the horrific realization slowly dawning on her. "This is the severance of familial and financial ties." I continued tapping the paper with my index finger. "It is a legally binding ironclad contract. You explicitly signed away any right to my assets, my assistants, and my liabilities. You legally declared that we are entirely separate entities." Chloe, no, she whimpered, taking a step back, her hands flying to her mouth. You can't do this. We are family. You can't just abandon us. I am not abandoning you, Serena, I replied, my tone devoid of any empathy. I am simply honoring the legal agreement that you enthusiastically demanded. According to the law and according to this document you signed, we are complete strangers. I folded the document precisely and slid it back into my pocket. And as for the $2 million that money was turned over to the FBI as physical evidence 3 days ago, it doesn't belong to me and it certainly doesn't belong to Bradley. Serena let out a sharp, devastated sob, her knees buckling slightly. She realized with absolute certainty that she was entirely alone. There was no bailout. There was no safety net. The empire was gone, and I had ensured that I was perfectly insulated from the blast radius. I looked past her, scanning the chaotic ballroom one last time. Vivian was still slumped in her chair, surrounded by the wreckage of her social standing. Bradley and Marcus had already been hauled out the side exit. The stage was empty, the screens blank, the flashing lights reflecting off the crystal chandeliers. I adjusted the cuffs of my suit jacket. I did not offer Serena another word. I turned my back on the weeping woman who used to be my sister. I walked down the center aisle of the Grand Magnolia Ballroom, my steps steady and resolute, parting the crowd of stunned elites, and I walked out the front doors into the cool, clear night air, leaving the ruins of their empire entirely behind me. 6 months later, the city had fundamentally changed, and so had I. The fallout from the Grand Magnolia Gala was absolute and uncompromising. Bradley was no longer a real estate titan making deals over expensive scotch. He was federal inmate number 40289, currently serving a mandatory 15-year sentence in a medium security facility in Pennsylvania. He was convicted of multiple counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. There were no country club visits and no tailored suits for him anymore. Just a brutal, regimented existence that stripped away every ounce of the power he had once wielded so violently. My father Marcus fared no better. The church council held an emergency meeting the very morning after the arrests and formally stripped him of his deaconship before the sun even fully rose. He was publicly excommunicated from the congregation he had systematically robbed. He struck a plea deal to avoid spending his final years in a federal penitentiary, agreeing to testify fully against Bradley in exchange for 5 years of house arrest and strict federal monitoring. But the real punishment was the absolute destruction of his legacy. His name, which he had spent a lifetime building into a monument of self-righteous authority, was now entirely synonymous with betrayal and corruption. He was a disgraced pariah confined to a modest rented apartment, forbidden from contacting the very community he had victimized. My mother Vivian and my sister Serena were collateral damage in the explosion they had helped ignite. When the federal agents executed the asset seizure warrants, they took absolutely everything. The luxury SUVs, the designer wardrobes, the offshore accounts, and the multi-million-dollar mansions were all liquidated by the IRS to pay back the stolen church funds and the massive tax penalties. Because they had both eagerly signed the severance of familial and financial ties, they had no legal avenue to access my accounts or demand my assistance. They were forced to move into a tiny 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. Serena, who had once mocked my off-the-rack clothing, was now working as a junior sales associate at a mid-tier department store, desperately trying to maintain a fraction of her former status. Vivian spent her days bitterly scrolling through social media, watching the elite circles she once ruled completely erase her from their collective memory. I, on the other hand, was called into the federal prosecutor's office on a bright, crisp Tuesday morning. I sat across the polished desk from Valerie Hayes, who had been officially reinstated to her position following the successful dismantling of Bradley's corrupt network. She slid a heavy manila folder across the desk, her eyes gleaming with genuine pride. The IRS whistleblower program is highly effective when we have airtight documentation, Valerie stated, opening the folder to reveal a certified federal treasury check. You provided the master ledger, the offshore routing numbers, and the audio confessions. Because of your direct actions, The government recovered nearly $40 million in illicit funds. By law, you are entitled to a percentage of the recovered assets. I looked down at the check. The number printed across the secure watermark was staggering: $8 million. It was a life-altering sum of money, a massive multi-million-dollar payout that legally, securely, and permanently belonged to me. I had started this journey with a $230 auction bid and a sledgehammer. Now I was walking out of the federal building with the financial power to dictate my own future entirely on my own terms. I drove straight back to the east side, pulling my car up to the curb on Elm Street. The neighborhood looked different now. The heavy, suffocating cloud of predatory foreclosures and impending demolition had completely lifted. Families were sitting on their porches, kids were playing in the streets, and the local businesses were thriving without the constant threat of Bradley's bulldozers. I parked my car and walked up the front steps of the property that had started it all. It was no longer a crumbling hazard slapped with an emergency demolition sticker. It was a masterpiece of historical preservation. Using the initial $2 million I had secured as a community development grant before the whistleblower payout, I had hired a team of expert contractors and local artisans. We spent the last 6 months painstakingly restoring every inch of the property. The sagging porch was now solid oak. The peeling paint was replaced by vibrant, historically accurate colors. The broken windows were refitted with custom stained glass. I unlocked the heavy wooden front door and stepped inside. The space that once held dust and rot was now transformed into the Elias Thompson African American Heritage Center. The walls were lined with interactive exhibits detailing the rich, vibrant history of the Civil Rights Coalition that had founded this very block. It was a fully funded operational community hub, providing educational resources, legal assistance for vulnerable homeowners, and a safe gathering space for the neighborhood youth. I walked through the main exhibition hall and out onto the newly rebuilt back deck. I leaned against the sturdy wooden railing, holding a steaming cup of coffee, and watched the sunrise paint the sky in brilliant shades of gold and orange. The air was cool and clean, smelling of fresh pine and absolute victory. I thought about the family who had rejected me, the sister who had mocked me, and the father who had tried to crush me. They had demanded I bow to their corrupt empire, but I had chosen to swing a sledgehammer instead. I took a slow, deep sip of my coffee, looking out over the neighborhood I had fought so fiercely to save. I was no longer the forgotten daughter or the family scapegoat. I was a protector, a preserver, and a multimillionaire who had beaten the corrupt elite at their own ruthless game. I stood on the porch of the house I bought for $230, completely victorious, entirely independent, and for the first time in my life, absolutely free. The recurring narrative woven through these stories, whether it's a daughter dismissed as a failure before unveiling a multi-million-dollar tech empire, or a sister uninvited to a wedding who discovers peace, while her family's facade crumbles, illuminates a profound and difficult truth about toxic family dynamics. Our worth is never defined by those who are committed to misunderstanding us. For years, the protagonists in these tales sought validation from a system designed to keep them small. They chased parental approval, endured the sharp sting of being the scapegoat, and watched as golden children were elevated despite their flaws. The turning point in every story was not the acquisition of wealth or the discovery of a hidden asset. It was the moment they stopped playing by their family's rigged rules. They realized that true independence is the ultimate safety net. The most crucial lesson here is that setting boundaries is not an act of cruelty, it is an act of profound self-preservation. When families choose the illusion of perfection or financial greed over genuine connection, they forfeit their right to demand loyalty. The sweet revenge these women achieved wasn't born from a desire to destroy their families, but rather from the quiet, unyielding power of standing in their own truth. They let the consequences of their family's own toxic actions do the destroying, while they focused on building authentic, successful lives away from the noise. It teaches us that sometimes the family we create is infinitely stronger than the one we were born into. We do not have to endure abuse simply because it comes wrapped in the word family. If you've ever felt diminished by those who should have protected you, Remember that your greatest triumph is choosing yourself. Start building your own legacy today.